D&D monsters have a lot of statistics to them, but one of the statistics we pay most attention to is a monster's challenge rating. But what does a challenge rating actually mean? A challenge rating is a loose quantitative measure of a monster that can be used to compare it to other monsters and compare it to a group of characters. It's really important to hang on to that word loose. It is not a perfectly accurate measure of a monster's difficulty. Many times if you look at multiple monsters of the same challenge rating, you'll see a very big difference in the amount of threat that they actually bring to the table. For a pure definition of challenge rating, we can look to the Monster Manual. The Monster Manual states, an appropriately equipped and well-rested party of 4 adventurers should be able to defeat a monster that has a challenge rating equal to its level without suffering any deaths. For example, we could take an ogre with a challenge rating of 2 and compare it to a group of 4 characters of 2nd level, and assume that those 4 characters are probably going to be able to defeat the ogre without dying. That's the only definition we have that compares a monster's challenge rating directly to the level of the characters. Now, this actually isn't a very good comparison because when you compare one monster to an entire group of characters, there's a great imbalance there, and that imbalance is with the number of actions that they can take. D&D nerds call this the action economy. The way it works is if any one side of a battle has more actions than the other, they have a distinct advantage over it. So even though you might have 4 second-level characters against a single CR2 ogre, that ogre is only going to be able to attack once, where each of those characters has their own action to attack once. So there's a definite discrepancy in the number of attacks that one side has over another when there's only one monster versus 4 characters. I mentioned before that a monster's challenge rating is a loose approximation at best, and if we think about this idea of comparing a single monster to a group of 4 characters, things really start to break down as the characters increase in level. As characters grow in level, the amount of power they have is not linear. There are certain points in their character progression where they get significantly more powerful. An easy one is the jump from 1st to 2nd level is a huge jump in character power, a good and important jump in character power. Going from 4th to 5th level is another major jump. 5th level characters are significantly more powerful than 4th level characters. The same can be true around 7th level when spellcasters get access to spells like Banish and Polymorph that can take out a single creature in one hit. And again, at 11th level and at 17th level, you see major jumps in the kinds of power that characters bring to the table. What that means is you can't really expect that any single monster of a challenge rating that's equal to the levels of the characters is going to actually be any kind of challenge as the characters grow in power. I know that I'd much rather face Orcus at 20th level than face a bunch of wolves at 1st level. This comparison of challenge level to character level actually doesn't help us very much because the kinds of encounters that we actually build in D&D can be varied. We have lots of small monsters, we might have a couple of big monsters, we might have a mix of monsters of different challenge ratings. So the Dungeon Master's Guide has a whole section about how to build encounters in order to fit the story that's going on, and how to determine what the rough difficulty of those encounters are going to be. Now, the Dungeon Master's Guide rules are actually pretty complicated, and they don't come up with a really accurate result in the end, so they're not really the best way to look at it. Xanathar's Guide to Everything actually has a better system for building encounters that I would recommend ahead of the Dungeon Master's Guide. But there's also a couple of online tools that you can use. D&D Beyond has an encounter builder that lets you build encounters and determine their difficulty, and Kobold Fight Club, linked down below, also has a way for you to build encounters and see what the difficulty is. But the reality is none of these things are doing a very good job at determining actual encounter difficulty because there's simply too many variables that go into an actual encounter to determine it based on just the math of challenge rating and character level. Some of these things include the environmental changes that occur during the fight, how well rested the characters are, the synergy of those characters, the experience of the players, the kind of magic items the characters have, the kinds of spells that they have access to. All of these variables can dramatically change the difficulty of a fight, and none of them are taken into account in any of the encounter building guidelines that exist. If you take only one thing from this video, keep in mind that any attempt to try to compare monsters to characters is a loose approximation at best. All of those variables are going to have a bigger effect than any challenge rating math is going to tell you. So the thing to really keep in mind is that any encounter building guidelines or any comparison of a monster's challenge rating to the character's level is a loose approximation at best. It's just giving you a general guide about how difficult something might be. Keeping this loose approximation in mind, I have my own system that I recommend called the Lazy Encounter Benchmark. The first thing we do when using the Lazy Encounter Benchmark is we determine what monsters make sense given the situation. Instead of trying to use any kind of encounter builder to build our encounters for us, we instead think about the kind of monsters that make sense given what's going on in the situation, given the location the characters are going to, given what kind of monsters might be there. If we're having trouble thinking about what kinds of monsters make sense for the situation, we can use the Monster Manual itself, reading the descriptions of various monsters, and we can also use Xanathar's Guide to Everything. It has a bunch of random tables in there we can use for different locations. The Lazy DM's workbook also has a list of different kinds of monsters given the dungeon level that the characters might be exploring. The second thing we do is determine whether or not the encounter we just built might be deadly. An encounter might be deadly if the sum total of monster challenge ratings is greater than 1/4 of the sum total of character levels, or 1/2 of character levels if they're above 5th level. As an example, let's say our group of 4 second-level characters are going through the woods and they run into 3 ogres. Now, the ogres all have challenge ratings of 2. So if we add up all of the challenge ratings of the ogres, we have 6. And we compare that to the sum total of character levels divided by 4. In this case, we have 4 second-level characters, or 8, divided by 4, and we're back to 2. So 3 ogres are definitely deadly against 4 second-level characters. We might look at that and say, oh, well, we're going to knock it down to 2 and see how they do, recognizing the fact that this is a deadly fight. Or we might drop it down to 1 so that it's a little bit easier for the characters. Now, let's say we have a group of 5 7th level characters who run into 3 frost giants in the frozen north. The frost giants all have a challenge rating of 8, so when we add all of the challenge ratings together, we have 24. We have 5 7th level characters. If we add that all together, that's 35 levels. Divided by 2 ends up being 17 if we're routing down. So we know that 3 frost giants are potentially deadly against a group of 5 7th level characters. If we don't want it to be quite as deadly, we don't think that that fits the situation, maybe we drop it down to 2, which is 16. Now we know it's underneath deadly. It'll be a little bit of a challenge, but they'll probably be able to take it out. The nice thing about the lazy encounter benchmark is that it's something we can keep in our head. It's pretty easy to remember. It also accounts for any number of characters of any given levels and any number of monsters of any given challenge ratings. All of those variables can change, but it's one simple equation that we can use in order to figure out, is this encounter potentially deadly? Now, of course, depending on all of those circumstances I mentioned before are going to change whether an encounter is deadly. I've definitely had it where I had an encounter that I knew was deadly and it was actually twice as hard as what the equation told me, but I knew the characters are going to be able to pull it off because I knew how that encounter was going to go. I knew some of the effects that were going to help the characters. I knew some of the synergies they had. Almost always, the knowledge you have about the characters and about your players is going to help you far more than any equation can help you. So the knowledge you have about the characters and the monsters and how things are going to go is probably going to be better than any sort of equation or any kind of tool that you can use to generally use an encounter. But having something to generally compare monsters to characters can help you at least get started. It can help you get that idea of, is this encounter that I'm running potentially deadly? So that is Monster Challenge Rating in a nutshell. I hope you found this video useful. If you want to see more tips like this, you can subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter, where you'll get a weekly D&D related article sent right to your inbox, along with a free adventure generator PDF. You can also get more tips and tricks to run awesome D&D games, the City of Arches sourcebook, a bunch of exclusive adventures, access to our dedicated Discord channel by supporting the Sly Flourish Patreon. You can find a link to the Patreon in the show notes below. You can also pick up my books Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, the Lazy DM's Workbook, and the Lazy DM's Companion, all 3 of which include tips just like this one to help you run awesome D&D games. You can find a link for picking up those books at the Sly Flourish bookstore in the show notes below. Thank you all very much. Have a great day and get out there and play some D&D.